Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon in this closing panel for Silhouettes, Images, and Word in the Harlem Renaissance. My name is Shawn Christian. I'm chairperson of the English department at FIU, Florida International University, and I served as a curatorial consultant on this wonderful, impressive, amazing, dynamic, long-lasting exhibition. Our celebrated curator, Christopher Norwood, who is here with us, Christopher and I were very invested in making sure that an essential part of Silhouettes focused specifically on the literature and art reflecting Black life beyond Harlem. Dr. Noël's lecture earlier and this panel help us center the place of the Caribbean as an extension of this theme. The title of our closing program, Harlem Renaissance and the Tropics, is partly inspired by Wilfred A. Domingo's chapter, Gift of the Tropics, in the 1925 anthology, The New Negro. Wilfred Domingo, a Jamaican-born writer and activist, was the first editor of Marcus Garvey's newspaper, The Negro World. In his chapter, Domingo discussed the migration of Black people to Harlem from the Caribbean and Africa. This Beyond Harlem theme is also framed in the anthology when its editor, Elaine Locke, declares, quote, "We are now presenting the New Negro in a national and even international scope." Locke precisely locates Harlem, New York as an exhibition of this dynamic and contends, quote, "The pulse of the Negro world has begun to beat in Harlem." As evidence, Locke notes, quote, "A Negro newspaper carrying news material in English, French, and Spanish, gathered from all quarters of America, the West Indies, and Africa, has maintained itself for over 5 years. Two important magazines, both edited from New York, maintain their news and circulation consistently on a cosmopolitan scale," end quote. Of course, the vibrant communities, Caribbean communities in South Florida are another motivation for this concluding panel. Our three panelists have experiences and perspectives that can help us shed light on the Caribbean influence of the Harlem Renaissance. Let me now introduce them. On my right is Dr. Alexandra Cornelius, who is the director of the Center for Women's and Gender Studies at FIU. She leads the center in promoting women's and gender studies research, curricular development, and Miami-based community partnerships. CWGS also houses the Black Mothers Care Plan, a community research partnership that uses participatory frameworks to improve the quality of care for African American birthing people. Dr. Cornelius is the PI on the recently awarded Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Affirming Multivocal Humanities Grant, supporting women's and gender studies. She also served as editor and supervised the relaunch of Ma Comer, the academic and literary journal of the Association of Caribbean Women's Writers and Scholars. Dr. Heather Russell is professor of literature and currently serves as the vice provost for faculty at Florida International University. She is the co-editor of Rihanna, Barbados, World Girl, and Popular Culture. Her monograph, Legba's Crossing, is part of a general body of scholarship on Black modernity. She has published on a wide array of subjects related to African American, Afro-Caribbean scholarly concerns, with recent essays on global African modernisms, included in UNESCO's Volume 9 of the General History of Africa, and most recently on Marcus Garvey, Popular Culture and Black Liberation, in the Cambridge University series on African American literature in transition, 1920 to 1930. In keeping with her commitment to studying the humanities, over the past 15 years, she has worked with various state-based affiliates of the National Endowment for the Humanities and with the National Humanities Center. She served many years as a lead scholar for the National Endowment for the Humanities Landmarks in American History seminar, Jump at the Sun, Zola Hurston and her Edenville Roots. And then we have Dr. Chantalle Verna. Gotta find your bio here, there it is. Yes. Dr. Verna is a heart-centered connector committed to spreading the word about the people, ideas, and resources she has come to know. One of the ways that she carries out this life mission is as Associate Professor of History and International Relations at FIU. Her research focuses on the relationship between Haiti's domestic and international affairs. She is the author of Haiti and the Uses of America, Post-U.S. Occupation Cooperation, 1934 to 1953. And she's also a co-editor of The Haiti Reader, published on Duke University Press with Lauren Du Bois, Kamaya Glover, Nadiv Menard, and Millery Paulinet, and has published essays in the Journal of Haitian Studies, Diplomatic History, and Routledge volumes on geographies of the Haitian diaspora and the decolonization and the United Nations. Let's give them all a warm welcome. So just a logistical note, we will start with a few questions from me to the panelists, and then we will turn to you all for your questions for them, but also for Dr. Noël, who will join us at the Q&A at the end. So I've reached out to my colleagues to ask them to think a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance in relationship to the Caribbean, and have come up with these questions for them. So we'll start with the first. When we consider the Harlem Renaissance in terms of the Caribbean, what text, figure, event, experience, or concept comes to mind, and how does it inform how we should think about that relationship between the Harlem Renaissance and the Caribbean? Who would like to go first?
Well, hi, good afternoon now. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you again for the invitation to participate. And so I'm gonna take it back, real back. So maybe I was 8 or 9 years old, and I'd say Langston Hughes for me. Just that was probably the starting point. I don't even know if I had read, had been introduced to Langston Hughes at the time, but I was brought to the Schomburg for the first time. And so those who were here this morning and might already know, right? So these are just like these entry points. And at that time, I really only knew of Langston Hughes, right, as sort of this iconic African-American author, poet, artist. And that was what the Harlem Renaissance was about. I grew up in New York, so it was all very New York-centric. But having grown up in a very Haitian-centric community in New York, there wasn't a bridge for me there. And so without filling in all the blanks, because we don't have time for that, fast forward to particularly doing work for the first book, Haiti and the Uses of America, it's just been so enriching. And again, on a personal and professional level, because again, my life growing up in the United States of Haitian descent, then now here in South Florida, again, added layers, to be able to see very, very clear connections. So I think what I would say is any entry point people have for their own personal interests, there's likely to be some way that it connects to the Caribbean or to some other place in the world. So I'll stop there, thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I would say for me, I grew up in a Garveyite home, so Marcus Garvey was very, very central to really my own upbringing, and of course, as I came into my own consciousness and started to research a little bit more about Garvey, and in particular, in the recent publication on Garvey, which actually kind of talks about and thinks about how did this mass movement even come into being. It was transnational. It is often, Garvey and Garveyism is often left out of conceptualizations of the Harlem Renaissance. And so just to give you an idea of the scope, so it's founded in 1917, right? So the Harlem Renaissance, right? Scholars roughly, right, locate the time frame 1917 to 1935. So founded right at the onset of the Harlem Renaissance. In 1920, the UNIA delegation, they had delegates from all over the world come. 25,000 delegates from all over the world are in Harlem. You have between 719 and 725 UNIA divisions alone, another 271 branches in other countries. So you have this global, transnational, massive movement whose central philosophy is about Black empowerment, Black self-determination, and really giving the lie to Black inferiority. So the whole notion of, Black is beautiful is very much rooted in the philosophy of Garvey and Garveyism. And I think this is a really, really important aspect of the Harlem Renaissance. Negro World, of course, which is the literary organ for the UNIA, similar to Opportunity for the Urban League, is actually the place where Zora Neale Hurston published her first and last poems. She didn't publish poetry after that. So Negro World, again, major work. And there's a story I came across from when I was doing research from Jomo Kenyatta from Kenya, first president of Kenya. And he talked about the importance of Negro World and the fact that, like many of the organs, people couldn't afford to purchase all of them. So they would get their one copy. It was smuggled in. It had been banned, smuggled in, and the children would memorize all of the content, and then they would travel around to the various areas and recite the content. So really, really powerful. So for me, Marcus Garvey is very, very central to my thinking of the Harlem Renaissance.
Okay. So for me, I was fortunate enough to be raised in an environment where an understanding of Black identity was global and transatlantic. I was really, really fortunate that my own household, my mother's from Haiti, my father's from Nevis, which is an English-speaking Caribbean island, and my grandmother lived in London. And so when Gilroy's Black Atlantic came out, I was like, finally, I have a way to, I'm a Black Atlantic. But that identity was not at all unusual. I grew up in New York, and I also had the great fortune of going to an elementary school that was, the principal was an Italian-American woman, but it was for bilingual, it was a bilingual school was the theme. Even though I was born and raised in New York, my mom, when she heard about the school, wanted me to go so that I would have a sense of Haitian heritage and also African-American heritage. So both were very much emphasized. We performed plays, reenacting the Haitian Revolution. There was this wall, life-size photo of Martin Luther King on the wall, and you just felt like he was watching you. So you better live up to the dream. And I kind of mean that literally. Like, we had a sense that our lives should have purpose because we were inheriting the benefits of the sacrifices that people had made for us, both in terms of our Haitian heritage and in terms of what we were able to do as a result of the sacrifices of African Americans in this country. As I got older, I remember I didn't understand the Schomburg because a lot of the material was archived. It's an archive, right? And so I felt like it takes so long. They don't let you run through the archive, So the place I loved was the County Cullen Library, which was like around because it was more like a traditional library, and it was there that I encountered these great books that featured photographs of the Harlem Renaissance, and I was introduced to Jacob Lawrence. And Jacob Lawrence has these wonderful, has a series on the Haitian Revolution, of course. And I was really curious about how they become interested. So I did find in an interview, he talked about how he became interested in Haiti. And he wrote, as children of the Harlem community, we grew up being told about these great Black heroes and heroines, Toussaint Louverture, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and so forth. I guess this was happening in Black communities all over the country. We would hear these stories from Black school teachers and Black librarians. We would also hear these stories from what I call street corner orators. Well, these heroes and heroines were so impressive that I naturally wanted to tell their stories. You can do that in a mural maybe, but at that age, I wasn't getting big mural commissions. I couldn't tell the story in one painting, so I decided to do a number of paintings of each individual. That's how that came about. So, and he talks about going to the Schomburg and taking notes and going home and painting and going back to the Schomburg and taking money. So that's why you have this series method of retelling the history. Mm-hmm. So I'll stop there.
Great. Given that you just mentioned the Schomburg, it is important for us to acknowledge Arturo Alphonse Schomburg, who is the preeminent archivist for the Harlem Renaissance. The Schomburg Library in New York is named after him, and frankly, without his collection, much of what we think about in terms of the archive of the Harlem Renaissance probably would not exist, along with his colleague Dorothy Porter as well. So thank you all for that opening set of responses.
Shawn, can I add,
please.
because some people may not know, right, about Schomburg's background.
Oh, yes,
You all
that's
would-
the point of bringing him up, yeah.
Right, so I think he's primarily acknowledged from, I guess his primary identity is a Puerto Rican, Afro, and of course someone at Puerto Rican who connected with his part of an African diaspora, but also was he born or raised in St. Thomas? And I don't know if anybody remembers, but there's a St. Thomas connection, there's a Harlem connection. So again, just wanted to say that for those who may not be familiar with. Yeah.
Yes. No, thank you. That was the point of me bringing it up.
That's okay. I forgot another part of my point too.
Yeah.
So much. It's so rich, right? That's
Yes,
the point.
yes. We are here in this wonderful place that many of us call home, Miami, South Florida. And I wanted our panelists to talk a little bit about their perspective on how they see the Harlem Renaissance legacy operating here in South Florida. And so to start us off with that, I'll ask Dr. Russell just to offer some insights therein.
So if you have not visited Florida Memorial, I encourage you to go to Florida Memorial. It was there, not at the site that it currently stands, but when it was in Jacksonville, that James Weldon Johnson and his brother Rosamond, James Weldon Johnson wrote, and Rosamond put the music to Lift Every Voice and Sing. And a lot of times, so there's a really great book called Escape from New York, I think it's called, and it talks about sort of the importance of thinking the Harlem Renaissance like outside of New York. In any case, so Lift Every Voice and Sing, otherwise known as originally the Negro National Anthem, now the Black National Anthem, was written to commemorate Lincoln's birthday and the emancipation that had taken place I guess it was nearly 40 years before. So James Weldon Johnson leaves Jacksonville, migrates. He actually goes on to be consul general in Nicaragua and Venezuela. So again, this like diaspora and transnational, right? They're all moving all around from the United States to the Caribbean. Comes back and realizes that this song, Lift Every Voice and Sing, has taken on a life of its own, right? And so really sort of, becomes the hymn that would really encapsulate the struggle, right? And the determination and the will and the courage, right, of Black people in the diaspora to flourish. And so fast forward to 1937, and Augusta Savage, the sculptor whose gammon is you all would have seen upstairs. It is absolutely beautiful. So Savage, really, her focus was on Black physiognomy, right? And the whole idea is that basically you have all of these caricatured representations of Black people, distorted representations, and she is invested in demonstrating through her craft the beauty of Black people. So she's asked to create an installation for the New York's World's Fair in 1937. So this is some 37 years after, basically, or more, after Lift Every Voice and Sing is penned. And so she does so. It sits 17 feet high. It was her largest commission. Absolutely beautiful. It was covered in Crisis magazine. There's one of the series you saw, Crisis, of course, upstairs. It was on the front page, but sadly, there were no funds to cast it. It was so huge. So at the end of the World's Fair, it was destroyed. But it is one of those. So when I go to Florida Memorial and there's a bust of James Weldon Johnson, I always think JWJ, Lift Every Voice and Sing, Augusta Savage. Florida has a massive connection to the Harlem Renaissance, not only through Zora Neale Hurston, who of course we will talk about, I'm sure, at some point, but also through James Weldon Johnson and Augusta Savage.
Right. Dr. Cornelius. Go this way. Go this way. Dr. Cornelius.
So, in terms of the connection to Florida and the Harlem Renaissance, I really think in terms of themes and the broader theme of migration. And it occurs to me that migration takes on several stages for migrants. There are probably maybe 3 to 4 migrations in the lifetime of migrants, right? So there's maybe if you're in the Caribbean, you may not necessarily come right to the U.S., right? Sometimes you migrate to a bigger island within the Caribbean or something like that before you come. Then there's the young adult place where you settle or raise children. Then there's and at each stage you have an opportunity to reinvent yourself, right? Then there's the retirement migration, right? The coming home for those who can't go home, right? And that was true for my family. So my family had migrated from Haiti and Nevis to New York and to and Chicago and Maryland, but in my mother's family, they all came home to Florida. And in doing that, I think the cultural reminders of Black identity become even more important when you're trying to recreate your home space. So, for example, I remember the Lowe Museum had a exhibit featuring Jacob Lawrence's Toussaint Louverture exhibit. And they put it on in February 2020. And it had to be eventually shut down because of COVID. And I remember making a run to Costco and getting toilet paper and water and then making a run to the Lowe to catch this exhibit. And every time there's an exhibit, I think, and there are many opportunities featuring Harlem Renaissance or Caribbean art in one of these Florida area museums, PAM. I mean, the Frost, again, we're really fortunate in that we have many opportunities to participate and view this work of art. It's also a way of kind of like maintaining a connection to one's identity or one's heritage when the reality of your circumstances won't allow you to actually go home.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Verna.
I love that I'm following your comments because what's coming to me is how when I was studying, I was in grad school, I was at Michigan State University doing a doctorate in comparative Black history. And I went to grad school and to Michigan State with the intention of doing African American urban history. And I was very much interested in questions of gentrification. I don't think I knew the term at the time, but I was sort of trying to understand my life here in South Florida. So this is kind of coming to your question about the landscape, Shawn. And so the reason that this work, these conversations, things that people are doing with digital mapping, the first person that I knew was another Michigan connection, Laura Stein Pardo, in anthropology. But I know there's this mapping of this history, right? When I go to Eatonville, I had to pleasure of going up to Orlando, go to Eatonville, and seeing this Tesla's coming up right next to, Zora Neale Hurston land, and I'm like, uh-oh, here comes a Tesla. So I'm about to lose my train of thought, but I'm trying to get back on. But yes, when I went to grad school, I went to study African American urban history, and every time we studied something, I kept bumping into Haiti. So to what Alex was just saying, I kept bumping into Haiti. And even though I was raised very rich awareness and pride around Haitian culture, music, the folklore, but I didn't have a depth of understanding of that, I don't even really know how much I heard about the revolution, quite honestly, And so then when you do start hearing about the revolution, that's all you hear about. And so, that's why it's been important for me in my work to emphasize the connections to Haiti and other places beyond 1804. And this period of the Renaissance and this travel of Haitians to the U.S. and Americans to Haiti, in all its richness, really highlights all of that. And so I think what I want to say in terms of South Florida is like, if we just look at these spaces and the people that are here, it does just a rich map of how we can follow that. Yeah, just kind of scratching the surface of things. Yeah. You want to say?
Thank you. Just two additional points on this. One is, Chris, during his tours, often talks about the stories that people bring with them, and he's been a long advocate for getting Black folk in South Florida to talk about their families' journeys to South Florida. And I would say that's another way that legacy is operating, right? There are lots of individual and collective family stories about that experience that we don't know, that sometimes even within the families aren't shared just because of trauma or other kinds of things. And so our exhibit has helped some of that story get told, and I'm really excited about it. The other is that some of you already know this, Miami was considered the Harlem of the South in the 20s. Public historian Nadege Green has talked about this a lot recently. And it's a really powerful kind of understanding to think about Miami being very much in conversation with the kind of dynamism and diasporan experience that was happening in Harlem. And so that is still, I would argue, I think most would agree, still at play now here in our contemporary moment. So we definitely wanted to give some acknowledgement to the fact that not only is that mix happening still, it's a part of the Harlem Renaissance legacy, but truthfully, it is what created this cultural effervescence, this Renaissance, frankly, right? This movement of peoples from the Caribbean, from Africa, to the United States and even to Europe, but also the returns. And I'm so glad you said that point as well. Speaking of legacy, we are in the decade that celebrates the 100th anniversary of the Harlem Renaissance. And so I can't say enough how excited we all are at FIU, especially that we got a chance to participate in that anniversary through this exhibit. And so I asked the panelists, and we'll start with you, Dr. Cornelius, what aspects should we focus on to deepen our understanding of the Harlem Renaissance legacy over the next 100 years?
Well, I think, for one thing, the periodization of the Harlem Renaissance. So our textbooks tend to compartmentalize things, right? And it's neat and organized. And but the Harlem, so to fix that, what historians do is we start referring to like the long Harlem Renaissance, right? Like, so that we understand that this isn't a movement that existed within a 10 to 15 year time span and died, right? That the artists keep producing work. Some of the work upstairs was actually put on in the 1940s, 1950s. So I think one of the things we need to do is get comfortable with with using, of course, like acknowledging those moments of intense creativity and support, right? But I think we need to recognize that the creativity, the effort to produce artwork doesn't end. What ends and what ebbs and flows is the support, right? Or the attention, right? And I'm not going to say anything political about funding of museums being cut. I'm not going to say that or anything like that. But I think in terms of looking out for the next 100 years, we do need to be mindful of the extent to which we need to safeguard and support our cultural institutions. I do think we need to be mindful of the fact that when we think about the Harlem Renaissance, even that is within a larger context of transatlantic movements, whether you're talking about negritude or even a movement that really tries to tap into efforts to protect and call attention to protect humanity, right? So for example, Jacob Lawrence has a whole series called Hiroshima that focuses on the impact of the bombing on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But we don't talk about that because it's like, it doesn't fit. But our artists always have a global understanding of processes, even if they don't fit neatly into our categories.
Wonderful. Dr. Verna.
Definitely that connects with, as I was looking through the pieces of the exhibit and the descriptions and getting a chance to know the artist or I don't know, you call it the patrons, right? That could be a whole other panel. I really paused on like the connections not only across the Caribbean, but again, thinking about Greater Caribbean, there's Mexico, there's Ukraine, there's Poland, right? And I think especially in this particular moment, which is a turning point for what's moving forward, the opportunity to do what these works were already doing, to be in conversation with each other, right? That was what was happening in Harlem and what was happening in Paris and what was happening in Miami or what was happening in Port-au-Prince or Havana, right? And some other places that we don't talk about maybe with as much fluidity. So I think just keeping into conversation with each other and to think about the sponsoring and the support. I was thinking about that a lot this morning, like how, when it starts, so to speak, because people are throwing money at it, so to speak, or there's an audience or attention for it, but it doesn't mean that these kinds of conversations were not happening before, that people were not creating. We're always in creation mode, even if we're just making a pot of something, right? And so it's also an invitation for us to invest in each other and to not, wait on whoever else. And the importance of what happens when we invest in each other as opposed to, that's part of the discussion, right? The critique of like what it meant for certain people to get sponsored, who got the money, which images were able to be presented. So definitely, yeah.
I so resonated, Alex, with what you said about temporality, right? Because we have this tendency to kind of want to fit these historical moments, not only in a box, but also in terms of, trying to measure impact in ways that really are ineffable, right? So I remember reading a very famous, I'll leave him anonymous right now, I won't say his name, but a famous historian who wrote about the Harlem Renaissance, sort of like one of the definitive books on the Harlem Renaissance, and ends it basically by saying, at the end of the day, once the stock market crashed and the money dried up, the Harlem Renaissance ultimately failed. And I was like, that's it, right? It just failed? And similarly, right, Garvey and Garveyism and the movement has been sort of codified in those terms, right? Like he's either this sort of like messiah or he's a buffoon, right? It's, all of that, the largest, greatest, multinational, transnational Black movement, and at the end of the day, he's jailed, deported, and the rest. And so it's just kind of like we do the same thing with Zora Neale Hurston, right? This is like we want to fit her into this rags to riches to rags story, And I think if there's anything that, you know, deeply engaging with the Renaissance asks us to do, it is to, and I think this is so important for today, it is to resist the tendency to contain, to limit, to want to fit things into these neat packages, these neat notions of, you know, rise and fall, and right, all of these binaries that we feel very sort of, you know, comfortable with, because we're accustomed to them, right? We want things to fit in these easily consumable ways, right? And I think the Renaissance resists that, right? It asks us to resist that notion, that tendency. And then the last thing that I would say is that representation really matters. Representation matters. And there were though many things happened prior to and after, there were also folk who gathered and they planned and they were architects of the Renaissance, and they were intentional about the representations. They were intentional about using the literary arms to disseminate images, to use the visual arts and use the written word to challenge notions and ideas about, you know, alleged black inferiority and all of the sort of racist notions that were there. It was intentional to supplant, to replace, to challenge, to give the lie to the idea of black inferiority. And so representation is really, really critical, and I think we might want to continue to think more intentionally today about that.
Yeah. I'll just add before we address the last part of our panel, turning to the exhibit itself. For me, placemaking is particularly on my mind as we go forward into the next 100 years of the Harlem Renaissance, because growing up here in Miami as I did, it was a profoundly moving experience to come back in 2020 and to see that part of the neighborhood that I grew up in is now named James Weldon Johnson Street on 103rd between 7th Avenue and 17th Avenue. That placemaking is absolutely critical, and I think it begins to not only talk about challenges with gentrification and the like, but how these stories operate in places too, not just the people. The other would be, of course, you know, the archive. And one of the reasons that the Harlem Renaissance, I think, is so profound for literary scholars and historians and teachers and just, you know, folk who are just interested in the period is that there's so much that we can work with. That materiality is there. And to your point, that intentionality was very much a part of the efforts of people like Du Bois and Alain Locke, who were very invested in as much as they were posterity, as they were in providing a kind of filling a void, frankly, right? There was not enough of the representation or even counter-representation, right? And I would be remiss not to mention Oscar Michaud, who I think is very, very important to this period for the reasons that we're talking about relative to representation, because you think about Birth of a Nation, 1915, cementing a lot of the stereotypes that were afoot about African Americans, racist stereotypes, and really, you know, pushing writers and filmmakers to respond and create these wonderful genres that we now celebrate in the visual arts too. So to that point, I did ask our panelists to reflect a little bit on the exhibit by identifying one or two pieces from the exhibit that resonated with them and to share with us why. I'll ask Luna, please, to advance the slide. To start us off, I did want to make reference to this particular image in the New Negro. Many of you know that Alain Locke recruited Wynald Rice, the German artist who taught Aaron Douglas and collaborated with Miguel Covarrubias, who taught him as well, to do several of the illustrations in the New Negro. And this one is titled From the Tropic Isles. And in honor of our women scholars here, I thought it'd be appropriate to start this discussion of the exhibit by looking at that particular image. So think we're on the round again where you're up first. Dr. Cornelius, let's please hear from you about your images.
As I've shared, certainly with Shawn and anyone who will listen, I was really moved to tears by this exhibit because there were so many examples of art that I'd only seen in books. And for me, like walking, the way that everything was just walking in, the energy really just deeply moved me. I was also really excited to be exposed to new pieces of art that I had not, and an artist that I had not known. So, and that's really wonderful. I want to speak specifically. I'll only speak about one.
Okay, fair enough.
I think I said like 18.
Yes, you did, but that's okay.
The painting by Eleanor Colburn, Harlem. I think it was one of the ones. There it is. So I love this so much. I actually sent, after seeing this, I sent you a picture of my mother and me that
Yes,
kind of
you
like
did, yes.
was almost exactly the same. And I talked to my daughter about this because motherhood looks very serious here, right? And that's part of the migration experience too. And I talked to her about it, and she said, "Well, you know, it must be real. It must be a real challenge to raise a child in a place that you've idealized, and then have to deal with the reality, good and bad, and the differences." So I just loved it. I love the child. I love, again, I don't know who she's looking at, but I think they may be in trouble. So I looked up Eleanor Colburn because I'd never heard of her. I don't think she's an African-American artist, which also, I'm like, wow, okay, because I was like, oh, who is this sister who captured my very, all my history, and so that was a lovely surprise too, because you think of the ability to tell stories or relate to other people as being, demarcated by racial lines, and that's not always the case. I would say this is an example of that.
Wonderful. Dr. Russell?
So, I mean, since I have to pick one, I'm gonna have to do Their Eyes Were Watching God. Oh, yes, right, that was the one. Okay, so I'm gonna have to say a little bit about Hurston and Their Eyes Were Watching God. I thought there there is another one, right? I think. It's all good. Okay. So, I will also echo Alex's remarks in terms of just how profound an experience it was to engage with the exhibit. And I'm gonna have to go back up after this because, So I was privileged to have attended Rutgers University, and I had a mentor, Dr. Cheryl Wall, who, RIP, miss her very much, who was a Hurston scholar. She was a preeminent Hurston scholar, and it was studying under Cheryl Wall that I became a self-declared, as we call ourselves, Zorahead, and had no idea at that time that I would actually move to South Florida, and then some years later be asked to lead this seminar on Zora Neale Hurston. Anyhow, connection to the tropics. 1999, a scholar named Daphne Lamotte writes the really paradigm-shifting article on Their Eyes Were Watching God. And Their Eyes Were Watching God, as many of you would know, is arguably Hurston's most famous novel. It's the only one that she writes outside of the United States. She writes it in Haiti in 7 weeks. It pours out of her, she says. And so for many, many years, scholars were like, she's in Haiti, this pours out of her. Where's Haiti in their eyes? Daphne writes an article. Hurston is, by the way, at the time, she's studying New World African religion. She's studying Obeah and Vodou. And so Daphne reads Janie, who is the protagonist in Their Eyes Were Watching God, through the sort of spiritual lens of Ursuli, the Vodou Loa. Ursuli, like Janie, had three husbands. Ursuli, and there are all kinds of connections to Haiti, and that moment changes forever the way that Their Eyes Were Watching God would be read. And there have been certainly, other scholars, as it were Soli, others who have published also on that. But it goes to show, here's this novel that published in 1937 for many, many years, is read outside of this rootedness in Haiti. And of course, the title, which for many years was hotly debated, right? What does this mean? Well, in the opening scenes of Their Eyes Were Watching God, Janie has come back into Eatonville, and all of the folk are sitting up on the porch talking about her and watching her. Their eyes were watching God. Yeah. So.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Verna.
So on the way to the one I'll talk about, if you can put up the book cover, Black Thunder, I just want to point to it. So that is just to say that this is an American, a Ukrainian-born artist, it says here. So I just wanted to point that for the image there, for my point earlier about the international. But I wanted to focus on the nude study of Sivilla, the Sivilla Fort by Ebba Rab. It's the nude study. Yeah, and it, like Alex, I was like, who's Ebba Rab? White lady from Seattle, but very interesting, also artist. I got a chance to read a little bit about her and women artist of Washington, so there's a little bit of stuff about there. But this, I chose this one, besides just being captivating and beautiful, and again, making peace with the nude studies, and I was looking at, again, it being a trend at the time. So Fort, among her experiences as a dancer, worked with Catherine Dunham. And so Dunham is a name I don't think that's come up in our discussion today, but also part of this same thing with Zora Neale, having spent time in Haiti as an anthropologist, and then just, again, the blending of disciplines. And I think I really love ending with this because evoking dance, we haven't had so much, there's a bit of music and movement in the film at the end of the exhibit. But again, through Haiti and Dunham and her technique, that is, again, I grew up in New York doing Haitian folkloric dance and knew nothing about Dunham technique until grad school, like decades later. So that's what this piece, that's what I think about when I see this piece, and I was glad to think through in just digging a little deeper at this beautiful image. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all so much. So we'll turn to any questions or insights that you all have, and I'll ask Dr. Noël to join us here on the panel, because of course there were probably questions from her lecture as well. I see a hand up already in the back there, Luna.
Good afternoon. Thank you guys for having this discussion. I appreciate the invitation. Many questions that I have. One, we discussed Harlem and the Renaissance in Harlem, but were there other American cities that were prominent during this era? Harlem is the apex, but were there other cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, other cities that drew attention, or did everyone convene in Harlem? And second, we discussed the Renaissance. The Depression came, the Great Depression, everything subsided. Were there any other movements after the Renaissance that gained notable attention? We look at Jim Crow, Harlem Renaissance, civil rights, but then were there movements in the civil rights periods? Were there movements beyond that? Like you have the Philly sound, the Motown sound. But what happened with us in art?
Well, okay, I'll just say really quickly, because again, I think there are many examples that can be raised, but as you spoke, I really appreciate the questions and the layers in them. Definitely, I think there was a little bit of reference to this here, that across the U.S., the new Negro movement, as it was, more often referred to at the time, right? The brand, to kind of contemporize it, right? It's a self-definition. It's a standing up. It's after a nadir period, right? A lot of bombings and terrorizing of communities to sort of stand up in the face of that, and for self-definition and affirmation, and also self-direction, back to the Garvey example. And then there was something else that you said that escapes me now, so I'll pass the mic.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say, because thank you for talking about the New Negro movement, because I think that's a term that I prefer to utilize, because it delocalizes this Renaissance. That is, because Harlem was the Black Mecca during that era, but there were so many other metropolitan centers and other parts of the U.S. where artists, writers, poets, playwrights, filmmakers were actively pursuing this effort to redefine and reclaim and be active agents in carving out and molding Black identity, taking that back, right? Instead of being, on the receiving end of this is who you are because that's the powers that be say so. This was a moment when they could be very active in shaping and defining Black identity. And even the term New Negro, right, was also, there are scholars who talk about the fact that it was, I suppose, the antithesis of the old Negro, right, associated with the South, the rural Negro, who is considered backward, right, and not sophisticated or politically astute, right, because the natural landscape was associated, right, with backwardness, whereas urbanity was considered with newness, the contemporary moment, right, the U.S. very much being seen at the forefront of the industrialized Western world, right, and so, with the dawn of the 20th century and America really truly defining this notion of, this major industrialized country, right? The leaders or, the stakeholders of the African American community really saw this notion of the new Negro movement as really affirming that African Americans, Americans of African descent, were also contributing and had always contributed to the United States being the powerful country that it was aspiring to be, and really pretty much was at that particular time. So yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah, so just, I guess, just in terms of it's reiterating the point that it wasn't specific to Harlem, but really across the U.S. and how African Americans were contributing, right? Not only to art that reflected the Black experience, but just culturally, politically, in every facet.
Yeah, I was just going to add, so I think I had mentioned, but I'm going to tell you the full name of the book, but I strongly recommend Escape from New York, The New Negro Renaissance Beyond Harlem. And there are a bunch of great, it's a collection of essays in there. There's a essay in there that actually talks about the kind of activism and both political and cultural flourishing that's taking place in New Orleans at the time as well, right? There's a great documentary called Faubourg Treme that really sort of makes, it begins sort of pre this period, right? But then moves all the way through Katrina. Again, I would strongly recommend. But back to Alex's earlier point about like the resistance, that we necessarily should resist sort of this periodization tendency that we have. I mean, you think about somebody like Richard Wright. Native Son is published in 1940, right? So 3 years after historians, the Renaissance is allegedly ended, right? And failed, exactly, and failed. So yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that, when we look at civil rights movement and black nationalist movements in the 1960s, late 50s, 60s, 70s, they're absolutely standing on the shoulders of their forebearers and the work that was taking place, in the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah. Just to add, I mean, I think the most immediate, if you want to call it successor to the Harlem Renaissance, to your point, was the Chicago Renaissance, where Richard Wright, Gwendolyn Brooks, and a number of figures are starting to kind of think about social realism in a very, very different way. And then, I know Chris is probably thinking this too. I'm always excited about any time to talk about Elizabeth Catlett, right? Who I figure is, she inherits a little bit of the Harlem Renaissance verve, but she's in Mexico doing her business, right? So I don't even want us to just contain it to other places or cities in the United States, right? It is a truly global phenomenon that is happening all the way into the 21st century, frankly, and continuing today. Other questions?
I also want to add to that. And Gwendolyn Brooks, so still understudied. One of our FIU alum, Kevin Quashie, he's now a professor at Brown, and in his book, the Sovereignty of Quiet, talks about quiet resistance and has a chapter about Gwendolyn Brooks's work. But I just also want to add that I think even in preparing for this talk, as artists and the poets and writers in particular engage issues specific, not just specific to African American or African diaspora experiences in history, but begin to speak more broadly in terms of working class concerns, they become very dangerous, right? I think they become very much subject to remember McCarthy era accusations of being communist, and so I think that may also be a reason why we don't know their later work as much as we do some of the earlier work. And just as an example, because Langston Hughes was huge in Haiti, right? People were translating his work, and in the same way Lawrence talks about hearing the history in the streets. People in Haiti were reciting his poetry in the streets. And one of the poems ends this way: revolt, arise, the black and white world shall be one, the workers' world, the past is done, a new dream flame. So, and Haitian intellectuals, some embraced it and some said, this guy's a commie, don't follow him. So I think that part of the story of why some people, we only remember some part of their very long body of work, maybe partly due because of the rejection of the class analysis that becomes embedded in their work.
Yes.
I also wanted to shortly address the second question about Black artists and what they were creating. Black artists were always creating, even during the era of slavery, just that they were marginalized and they weren't, certainly during slavery they weren't considered fully human, but after slavery they were still creating art well into the 20th century. It's just their art wasn't being collected by acquisition by museums. They weren't being represented by galleries. They didn't get even half the support that their white counterparts were. And this is the same for other racially marginalized artists as well. But in regards to other major movements after the Harlem Renaissance, they were creating and were inspired by and crossing paths with a lot of the major canonical artists in the US and Europe. But I would say, like, obviously, like the next major significant movement, creative movement of African Americans would have been the Black Arts Movement. That was the creative arm of the Black Power movement. Yeah.
Thank you. Wow, I'm really, really happy that I came. My question has to do with the Works Progress Administration and, you know, artists that were supported and paid by government. So when we look at Aaron Douglas's work, and we also look at, who's the other person that did? Oh, William H. Johnson from Florence, South Carolina. They were doing a lot more stuff related to race riot and racial stuff and so forth. And I wondered, I know they had outlets like the Crisis magazine, but were there other outlets for them, or was there more support for the people that did nudes instead of politics? You know, because I'm curious about that, just what kind of support people got when we questioned what was going on racially, particularly since in the 30s we also had all these lynchings going around, you know, America and so forth. So I'm just curious to know how that manifested itself. And that's for anybody who'd like to respond. Thank you.
Visual arts.
With the WPA program, I mean, that was, you know, during the Great Depression and, you know, this interesting socialist period in the U.S. with, you know, the government's being the major patron of the arts at that particular time. And so, you know, artists, writers, playwrights, you know, they were definitely encouraged to create works that appeal to the masses, right? And with regards to art, that, you know, often manifested in public art, murals, mostly, sculptures, I think, to like a lesser extent. And of course, you have to think about, speaking of transnationalism, right, the immense influence of the Mexican muralism, right? De Rivera and others, you know, De Rivera himself even creating a number of, well, I think at least, well, yeah, definitely two that I recall, but, you know, right, the Rockefeller Center, which was destroyed, but the one at the DIA in Detroit, right, still remains. And it's, every time I go to the DIA, I always marvel at the brilliance of that mural, right? But yeah, I mean, these were, in terms of the arts, the visual arts, it was mostly through, you know, like murals, like public artworks, yeah.
So the Crisis was the only outlet for these political?
I mean, artists definitely were given opportunities to create illustrations for the Crisis, but the Crisis, I'm not sure the source of funding
It was
for
like
it.
Opportunity Magazine was also another one that would have been the arm of the National Urban League, and then Negro World from the UNIA were sort of the principal ones. And what's interesting is that you know, when we look at the circulation, it's really very deceptive, right? When we look at the circulation numbers, because we know that, you know, someone would purchase one and then it would be like distributed at, you know, at the church, and everyone is like reading it and so on, and so.
I would just add another way to think about support. A lot of Harlem Renaissance writers and artists especially went to HBCUs to really do their work, and I think we don't know all the layers of, I'll be frank, radicalism that they bestowed upon their students, but you can imagine someone like Toni Morrison studying at Howard and having Elaine Locke as a professor possibly gain some insights from those perspectives. So another way to think about that support are Black institutions who took them in for various reasons and having long careers at these institutions. And of course, we just talked about Augusta Savage most recently. They created their own institutions. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, those things weren't supported in the ways that they should have been, and she struggled a lot to keep her school open. But that, you know, self-determination, the Garvey kind of piece of it, I think is another way to think about that support too. Yeah, sure. There's a question here in the front, Luna, first. Yeah. Who had his hand up?
looking into the next 100 years, how do you assess the pros and cons of new media and the digital age in terms of perpetuating the conversations, the challenges that Black artists are presenting? I'll leave it at that.
So do you mean like how artists are like utilizing technology, or like specifically media arts?
Well, yeah, I mean the magazines like Crisis that has been referenced quite a bit here. There, of course, are print publications that continue, but there's an increasing digitization of artistic expression and literature. And how do you all? There are pros and cons in that paper, tends to last, and digital media, if they're not continually renewed as the technology changes, they may disappear.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like right now, I know there are a lot of really interesting conversations and concerns that visual artists have with regards to AI and their intellectual property, their creative property. So there certainly are sort of like ethical implications, right, when it comes to how technology is utilized, or how it's even used to like replicate, a particular like artistic, a particular aesthetic of an artist, right? In the same likeness in which an artist will typically create a work. And so there are all of these like fundamental issues with, given the trajectory of technology today. I mean, certainly when it comes to like archiving and having digitally available, like artworks, I mean, that's certainly one positive consequence of how technology could be used, even for, art historians as well, having, digitally available like archives to making that accessible. I mean, there's certainly a lot of advantages, but with regards to the creative endeavor, there are advantages and disadvantages. There's this new it's been around, I guess, 5 or 10 years, but a new sort of like a particular like style of art that's called like media art. And when you talk to like art historians, even artists, and you ask them, so what is media art? There often isn't one singular definition of it, but certainly utilizing different forms of media and technology to create a work of art, that is often graphically based, technologically based. These, I guess, are just some of the ways in which technology is influencing the creative process. Yeah.
I'll just say quickly that I think this is another place where those who are interested and have any sort of resources or connection to resources to support the archiving, preservation of materials, and I would say not only the images, but also the conversations. I mean, as a historian, I'm always like, anytime I'm online, social media, I say, or text, so things that are so robust conversations that are taking place digitally, that they're not going to be these manuscript papers and letters that we have access to. If we go to a Schomburg, come to the Wilsonian. So, people who have the interest and the resources to support, financially, let me be explicit, I think it's very important for the acquisition and also for the curation. I mean, I can imagine the resources that it took to put this work together. Yeah.
I've been signaled that we have time for one more question.
I'm just going to stir something up. But my sister, you were discussing the painting. You say, okay, well, who is this sister did this? Who painted this, whatever. So much of our work was stolen. How do we know that that was not a sister that made that painting? Because when you discuss sculpture, when you discuss everything, if we didn't have the presence or the opportunity to preserve our work, we didn't have the presence to have our work acknowledged, how do we know if there was not a woman that painted it and someone else said, I'm going to take credit for this. I'm going to take credit for this. I'm going to take credit for this.
That's I guess that's a question for.
Have you noticed anything in
the
your study
curators?
that
I
there have
don't
been
know,
any-
but I couldn't. Listen. I tried to find a black woman responsible for that. I wanted to person. I couldn't find very much on the artist, and what I found, I was just like, I don't think this is a black woman. But the curators would know more. But I think we don't. There's so much. I don't think we should be protective, of course, of our art, no question. But I don't think we should reject art that communicates an experience that may not be specific to the racial identity of the person creating it, but does connect maybe on some kind of human level to the experience. But yeah, listen, if you find out this is a black woman who made this, I'd be happy. That's fine with me.
If I may, I can address that. Yeah, so for instance, this piece right here, Ebba Rapp, she went to school with Sylvia Ford. So she was a classmate of hers in art school at an art school in Seattle. Ms. Colburn is known as an artist that actually had a theme of mother and child. And so she did paintings of Navajo women as well as African American artists. So she has a career of doing that.
I'll just add this, because it is a provocative question, and in this moment where museums in particular are reckoning with their own acquisition processes and the like, it's important to ask things like that. So on one hand, I would say we have to assume there was some theft, right? We just have to assume that there was some theft, frankly, right? But we'll never know definitively. I mean, things kind of get lost to history in that sense. But the other thing is to recognize what is left. We have to do our work to really understand the provenance of how things came into existence. And in some ways, this exhibit helps us think about that, right? The mix of artists, nationalities, context, backgrounds help do that. So as much as there is on the Harlem Renaissance, there's still more that we have to do to preserve it. And that's why I think we have a lot of opportunity for the next 100 years. So I'm very excited at that. I'm gonna close now by doing a couple of things really quickly, hopefully. First, some thank yous. We have to, start this process of thank yous from me personally to Nathaniel Cato and Rebecca Friedman, who I worked with to bring me into the Wolfsonian. Casey Stedman, Mickey Wolfson, and the entire Wolfson Advisory Board, some of whom are represented today, and the staff. Of course, Luna Goldberg, Sasha La Madrid, who is in the back, Susana Perez, I think is still around, and Frank Luca, the chief librarian here, who pulled all of these works for us. Richard Miltner, who I must absolutely acknowledge because for those of you who really love the experience of moving around the exhibit, we owe him eternal thanks. Richard has apparently retired recently, and so I remember when Chris, after the first time we got a chance to see the space, I was floored because the choices that he made, the colors are it's warm, it's inviting, but it also felt very, very nostalgic. It made me feel like I went back to the Harlem Renaissance. Obviously, I wasn't from that time, and I can't end these thank yous without thanking two people in particular. So personally, I came back home to Miami in 2020 after being away for many years. And if someone had told me in 2018, even 2019, that in about 4 years, you're going to get to experience your research in the most profound, dynamic way possible, I'd have been like, you're out of your mind, because my book came out in 2016 and nobody reads it. Like, yeah, it's a wrap, But fortunately, I was invited to join this dynamic curatorial team, and so I want to thank and ask both of them to come up, John Mogul and Christopher Norwood, by giving them just a personal gift. You mentioned Kobina Mercer earlier, and I just want to say thank you to both of you guys for bringing me on board and having me do the thing with you all.
Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you. If you take the mic and give us some closing words. Oh, well, we do that after. Yeah. Ask Chris to give us some closing words and we'll get that picture in. Get the president. Yeah, we'll do the picture later. We'll do the picture later. We'll do the picture later. Go ahead, just say it.
So I gave my thank yous to people via email because I was like, I'm gonna forget to do it. I'm just gonna ditto everything that Shawn said, and first of all, the Harlem Renaissance is the most important American art movement in history, and I say that because it touched theater, it touched the visual art, it touched literature, touched music, and I challenge anybody to tell me an art movement that has done that. I believe it's the most important art movement, and what was done here this past 6 months, whatever it was, my research, I consider this institution a major art museum, and there's only been 3, perhaps 4 surveys of Harlem Renaissance art ever done. And so I'm going to claim that this is the 4th, and that we've moved it up the ladder. There's so many topics that come about when I think about all that has done and all that we've done together. And but one thing that I really love about the show, it speaks to the allies that allow Black folk to be who we are. And sometimes we have our own self-determination that will be undisturbed. We will fight through it all. But I wanted the show to also speak to the allies that help us along the way. So it was publishing companies. You know, these were major publishing companies that these books, for the most part, were published in. There were foundations that supported these efforts. And so the story of Upstairs is about Black self-determination. It's about Black spirituality. It's about our own portraiture, telling our own stories. It's about the importance of Haiti as an inspirational, as an inspiration to the Harlem Renaissance. It's about a lot of things, but it's also about partnerships. And as we move forward in this discussion, you know, for the next 100 years, there's many different stories, but we have to partner with our friends and colleagues to help us share it. So those are my final thoughts. Everything else has been said. Thank you very much, Shawn.
All right. And let me thank our panelists and our guest lecturer, Dr. Noël first, Dr. Cornelius, Dr. Russell, and Dr. Verna. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Can I?
I hear there's time to still check out the exhibit, so please.
Before we go, can I just say one thing? Can we also thank our phenomenal moderator and right, and your mind, right? And I want to make, I'm so happy that you mentioned your book, but I was going to try to make sure that people know that, you know, you've authored this work to pay attention to not only those who created, but those who were consuming, those who were the new Negro reader. And so, right, our attention to the work. So the artists need not only the investors, but they also need the audience. And so thank you for bringing our attention to that. And so, yes, to the exhibit.
All right.
Thanks.
Appreciate y'all. Thank you.